The Duellists by C.P. Webster. Lieutenant Tom Allenby was in trouble. The last blast of machine gun fire had hit the engine, and hit it hard. The biplane was stuttering, and it was now forced to cast his oil-blackened goggles aside, desperately wiping at his face and cursing himself for a damn fool. The German fighter had been in his sights when he had dropped down behind it, but he had realized too late that it was a Hanover. That meant a rear gunner, and the Parabellum MG-14 had blasted out before he could throttle away, frenziedly returning fire. He was too far over the German lines to look to land now, but down he must soon go. Allenby gripped the joystick tensely and squinted into the rushing, frigid air, tears coursing down his wind-blasted face. Then he saw a dark bank of dense cloud ahead of him, shimmering with sheet lightning. He blinked and stared in surprise, once more wiping at his streaming eyes. The day had been bright and the skies clear, but he thanked Providence for the strange, anomalous thunderhead. Wherever it had sprung from, it offered hope. He glanced back. The slower Hanover was now catching up to the American airman's stuttering biplane, but nothing could turn like a Sopwith Camel, and he flung the joystick hard to the right even as the German closed with him. Bullets raked the Sopwith's tail as he dropped and turned, now fighting to prevent a stall. He hit the dark mass of the cloud as a further fusillade rattled out behind him. Then he was in. Allenby straightened the stick and snatched a glance at the instruments as the cloud embraced him. The compass was spinning wildly, and airspeed was dropping. Electric flickers of plasma danced along the wire bracings of the wings, illuminating the gloom, even as the rain pelted the pilot in a sudden deluge. Wide-eyed, he gripped the stick and strained his ears above the dying roar and splutter of his own machine for any sound of his pursuer. Then the engine coughed, and the aircraft jerked downwards. Allenby pulled back on the stick even as the stall began, the plane now billowing smoke and sputtering spasmodically. He heard the wind whistling through the wires and struts. Somewhere above him, the Hanover's engine roared. It was close. Then he was out of the cloud and the ground was rising fast to meet him. Oberleutnant Eldridge Beck cursed his luck. He had had the Sopwith. Now this cloud had suddenly appeared from nowhere. But he was not going to lose this kill, cloud or no cloud. This would be his 5th confirmed kill, and that would mark him as an ace. Besides, he wanted revenge for the death of his spotter, Brandt. He had liked the cocky Saxon, but the last desperate volley of fire from the Sopwith's pilot had killed the rear gunner instantly, and Beck knew he was close. He could hear the labouring engine of the Sopwith, but this verdammt missed. He looked about him in both wonder and frustration. Then he cleared the vapours, and all thoughts of the dogfight were suddenly flung from his mind as he stared perplexed at the scene before him. The Hanover now roared over a seemingly endless dark vista of flat, cracked earth. A solitary spire of rock dominated the horizon before him, and Beck eased back on the stick and circled the pinnacle gaping. Sitting on the summit of the hill was a ruinous castle or temple, built from the same dun stone of the precipitous heights that it crowned, and all about the soaring rock lay league upon league of some vast and dreary desert. Beck circled the rock and looked back at the grim flats that lay about it. There it was. The Sopwith was down, and he could see fire and smoke from the engine. He brought his own plane about and dropped lower, looking now in wonder at the dark, ominous mass of cloud through which the 2 aircraft had passed. It hung before him like a massive, looming zeppelin, eerie flashes of some electrical discharge pulsing from within. But it was shrinking even as he stared, folding in on itself and fading rapidly as if evaporating. This made no sense to him. What was this place? The wild, barren landscape offered no answer as he circled the Hanover about once more and brought it down ever lower. The black and cracked earth seemed to stretch away from the rock into forever. His hands were shaking as, reaching a decision, he took the plane down. He eased the Hanover into a bumpy landing and then, gunning the engine, taxied towards the crashed Allied plane. When he had cut the throttle, he stared disconcertedly about him, his eyes once more taking in the alien landscape. And as the engine died, he was unsettled to hear a strange, moaning wind floating across the seemingly empty wastes. The air had a sulphurous, metallic taste. But the dour daylight was fast fading, though he could see no sun in the monotonous greyness above. Then, eyes pivoting back to the down plane, he pulled off his goggles and aviator cap, and releasing his 4-point harness, climbed out of his cockpit. He looked about him once more, then jumped down onto the dark, cracked earth below. Pulling his Luger from inside his long leather coat, Beck raced across to the crippled Sopwith. The enemy airman was bent forwards in his seat, but he was alive. Beck could hear him groaning. His face hardened. For a moment, he levelled the gun at the injured pilot's head. Then, with a wild, uneasy glance about him, he quickly holstered the Luger and climbed up onto the crippled plane's wing. Even as he hauled the stricken airman onto the ground and dragged him clear, the fire reached the Sopwith's tanks. There was a rush and a whump of sudden flame. Turning from the conflagration, the German looked around. Wherever they were, night was coming. Allenby groaned, and opening his eyes, looked dazedly about him. He was lying on a rubble-strewn paved floor. Gargantuan stone pillars rose above his head, reaching into a fathomless darkness. The colossal space where he lay was dimly illumined by a grey, pallid light that filtered in through a deep fissure in one of the towering walls. It looked like a ruined cathedral, but there were no statues, no altar, seating or crucifixes. What's more, why was it so quiet? He strained to listen. Nothing. No sound of guns, no crump of artillery. Astounded, he stared about him, trying to rise, but he could not. He arched his back and tried to move his arms. "What the deuce?" he growled. Allenby suddenly realised that his arms and legs were bound. His eyes roamed about him, uncomprehending, equal parts of panic and anger now rising within him. Then he heard booted feet approaching. A man walked into the fissure's dimming light before him, momentarily silhouetted. "Guten Abend, Herr Amerikaner." Allenby blinked, his mouth twisting in a sudden rage. "Let me out of these goddamn ties, you crouched son of a bitch," he shouted. "Where the hell am I?" The newcomer moved closer and crouched down. Now Allenby could see him more clearly. The man's lean face was pale and drawn. Cold blue eyes regarded the American impassively. "I think we are in hell, but the beast has not yet revealed himself," he whispered with a smile, reaching into his pocket and taking out a cigarette case. "What is your name, Yankee?" he said, lighting a cigarette. Allenby looked at him astounded. "Fuck you," he spat. The German tutted and stood once more. "You are not very grateful, my friend. It was hard work dragging you up to this place, whatever this place is." He looked about them and sighed, drawing quietly on his cigarette. "Well, if you'll not tell me, I at least shall tell you. I am Oberleutnant Eldrich Beck. I am the pilot who shot you down and saved your life. But we are no longer in France. Think about that for a little while." Then Beck turned abruptly and walked away, strolling back into the deepening shadows. "Hey!" Allenby cried. "Where are you going? Untie me, you bastard!" But the German's footfalls faded away into the darkness of the massive hall. "2 moons," a voice said in his ear. Waking from an uneasy slumber, Allenby started and opened his eyes, staring into the blackness. He grunted as he tried to sit up. One arm was numb where he'd been lying on the bare, hard floor, and he was shivering. "Damn, it's cold," he whispered. "Is that you, Beck?" "What was that you said?" He was answered with a derisive snort from nearby. "Who else?" the German answered. "And I said there are 2 moons, so I think dawn is coming." Allenby moved his head about, trying to pierce the darkness. The German was clearly insane. What was that he was prattling on about? 2 moons? "I can't see a goddamn thing," he said, attempting a level, reasonable tone. "Look, won't you untie me? It's damned uncomfortable on this floor." But Beck ignored his pleas. We shall see what the day brings. This is a strange place. Very strange indeed. There was a flare of light as Beck struck a match, and Allenby, blinking now, briefly saw the German's face disconcertingly near to his own. Allenby was discomfited by the intensity of Beck's gaze. Then they were in darkness once more, save for the red, glowing coal of the other man's cigarette. Allenby lay back. "What is this place?" he asked at length, his voice now low and subdued. "Are we in no man's land? Why is it so quiet?" "No man's land, certainly. But you will soon see," was all the German replied, and Allenby heard him moving slowly back off into the darkness. Allenby was still shivering when Beck returned. It was dawn now, or whatever passed for daylight in this tomb. Far above his head he could see a vague, dim illumination, as if there was some great aperture or rent in the roof, and a grey, sickly light leached in through the cleft in the far wall. Beck strode towards him out of the lifting shadows and regarded his captive. He pulled a Webley revolver from his pocket and smiled. "Here is your gun, Herr Amerikaner. I shall return it to you as a token of my good intentions. Now, I think you ought to see what I have found." He glanced about him. "I am going to release you, but you must not try anything. I have my own gun handy." Allenby looked at him warily. "So, you're going to untie me then?" The German nodded, and laying the revolver on the floor, reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. Swiftly he sliced through Allenby's bonds and stood back, his hand resting on the hilt of his Luger. Allenby stretched his cramped limbs, wincing. "What's the big idea tying me up?" Beck shrugged. "You are my prisoner, or were, but I have had a change of heart during the long night. Wherever we are," he said, glancing once more about him, "I think I need an ally, not a burden. Pick up your gun and stand up. Once you see what I'm about to show you, you will understand our situation a little better." Allenby stood unsteadily, and with a glance at Beck, picked up his revolver and checked the chambers were still loaded. He looked at Beck suspiciously, but the German now extended his hand. "Would you care to introduce yourself?" he asked. Allenby took the German's hand reluctantly and shook it. "I'm Tom Allenby," he said, holding the pistol tensely. "Very good, Herr Allenby," Beck said with a sardonic smile. "Drink, and then comes this way." He passed a canteen of water to Allenby, then, turning his back upon the American, beckoned Allenby to follow. "What the hell?" was all Allenby could manage, as the two men stood and looked out across the vast and barren wastes before them. They were stood upon the ramshackle remains of a balcony that lay beyond a high arch in the looming walls. From the eyrie high up on the jagged rock, the seemingly endless and barren wastes stretched as far as the eye could see in either direction. Beck looked at the American, and then pointed down to a thin winding trail that wound up the rocky steeps below them. "That is the path I brought you along yesterday. It was a hard climb, encumbered as I was." He then pointed to the left, and Allenby saw the distant outline of Beck's aeroplane and the burnt-out remains of the Sopwith. "I have plenty of fuel, but not, it seems, a destination." His words trailed off. He turned to Allenby and smiled. "At the very least, you now understand why we must have a cessation of hostilities. Wherever the war is, it is not here." He paused deep in thought and then said, "Have you ever read the works of your compatriot Norman Bean, Herr Allenby?" Allenby frowned and shook his head. Beck lit a cigarette. "I thought all Amerikaners read the pulps." He looked back across the endless plain. "My father used to bring them back for me when he made his business trips to New York. As a youngster, my favourite magazine was The All Story." He smirked and looked back out across the desert below them. "Well, in one of Bean's rather curious stories, there is a gentleman who, how shall I put it, he passes through a portal that takes him elsewhere. In this case it was to Mars." He dragged once more on the cigarette. "I'm afraid that I have no better explanation than that, Allenby. Somehow, in some way, that strange electrical cloud you passed through yesterday was more than some abnormal meteorological phenomenon. Of course, I would not believe such a tale if I heard it myself. He looked at Allenby and shook his head. But as a 17th century English clergyman once said, seeing is believing, but feeling is the truth. We are here. I see it, and I feel it. He slapped his hand on a great block of stone beside him. However, I do not believe that we are anywhere as remotely close to our own world as Mars. But wherever this is, it is most certainly not our world. He flicked his cigarette end over the semi-ruinous balcony wall and pointed out towards the horizon. I stood out here last night and saw 2 moons rising in that sky. Allenby scratched his head and stared at him bewildered. Why, this is just too much for a fella to comprehend. He patted his pockets and pulled out a briar pipe that he distractedly began to stuff with tobacco from a small leather pouch. I don't pretend to understand this, Allenby went on, waving the pipe stem at Beck. Well, if anything, I would figure I hit my head too hard when I crashed, and this is all some kind of awful hallucination. But I was too cold and too uncomfortable last night. Well, that felt real enough. He cupped his hand around a match and held it to the bowl of the pipe, puffing at it until the tobacco was smoking. So what do you propose we do? Allenby said at length, somewhat bleakly, casting the match away. I presume you haven't got any grub, and I can't see any water in this hellish place. If we stay here, we'll end up going mad of starvation and thirst. Well, there must be a way, a means, that we can get out of here. Well, there must be. Allenby rubbed his eyes and looked up at the drear sky above, suddenly despondent. Beck shook his head. No, I have no grub, and what water we have must be rationed. He patted the canteen that hung over his neck on a long strap. We might, perhaps, take the plane and fly it for as long as the fuel holds out. There may be an oasis, or a river, or perhaps even some form of extant civilization, somewhere beyond the horizon. Well, this structure at least proves that some form of intelligent life was once here. The German turned away. But come, Beck said. I have something else to show you. Allenby stared at him quizzically, and then followed the other man as he walked inside. Beck led the American back into the gloomy interior and along a massive pillared cloister, stopping after about 100 yards before a set of worn stone steps that led down into darkness. Down there? Allenby said doubtfully. Beck only nodded and began to descend. The stairway was steep and massive, the steps oddly deep as if made for legs longer than a man's. They descended into the dim depths, the immense stair only illumined by narrow embrasures on one side, through which the light of the external world wanly filtered. At last, after several minutes' descent, they reached the end of the stairwell and stood before a crumbling arch. Beyond, Allenby could see a wide passage lined on either side by towering statues. He whistled in awe as he slowly approached the nearest carving, the hairs on the nape of his neck beginning to prickle. The depiction was vaguely humanoid in form, but the gargantuan figure had 4 long ape-like arms, each terminating in hands with 6 fingers of equal length and no thumb. The high, gloom-shrouded head grimaced down at the observer with a bestial grin. Come, Herr Allenby, Beck said quietly, not pausing. He strode on down the gallery to a further arch and stopped before 2 massive ebon doors. Allenby could not determine of what material they were made of. There were no joints or planks that he could see, and he concluded that they were cast in some dark, seamless metal. Allenby walked slowly towards Beck, his head turning from side to side to stare with distaste at the monstrous representations that lined the hall. In here, Beck said in a hushed tone, now reaching for one of the doors. He heaved at the high handle on the left-hand door and managed to open it far enough for them to squeeze through. What were you doing down here, anyways? Allenby asked, squinting into the dark sepulchre beyond the door. Beck struck a match. I was reconnoitering, he explained. Whilst you wandered the halls of Hypnos, I was exploring this crypt. Will you enter, Allenby? Will you come inside? He looked at the American expectantly. Allenby returned his gaze, frowning, and then shrugged. Hell of a way to spend the night. Sure, I'll come in. Well, show me what you found. Beck stepped inside and, grimacing, Allenby followed him. In the pale light of the flickering match, Allenby now saw that they were standing in a wide, high-walled space, empty save for an elongated pyramid made of some dusky, smooth stone, whose pinnacle reached up into the dark heights above. It stood at the exact centre of the room. Beck lit another match and, placing his hand on the other man's shoulder, gently pushed the astounded Allenby forwards. Look, Herr Allenby, behold, the tomb of Heru Raha. And Allenby reluctantly walked closer, gazing at the weird pyramid, his scalp prickling and his hair now standing on end. What? He whispered. What did you say it was? He was answered by a resounding crash as the door closed behind him. Allenby spun about in the sudden darkness. Beck, he bellowed. What the hell are you doing? Let me out of this hole. The American stumbled in the direction of the door. Hands outstretched, he found the smooth metal and began desperately feeling for a handle or latch. But his searching fingers found nothing but a cold, smooth, unyielding surface. Beck, he now roared, pounding on the door. God damn it, you swine! Open this door! He patted his pockets and, reaching inside, pulled out his own matches. With trembling fingers he struck a match and held it up to the door. Beck! He called again, banging on the metal with his fist. Beck! Turn around, Herr Allenby, a muffled voice said from the far side of the door. You are about to receive a singular honour, and I thank you for coming to the chamber so willingly. Allenby dropped the spent match and lit another. What the hell is your game, Beck? I'll open this goddamn door, or so help me. But his words died away as he heard an ominous grating of stone behind him. Allenby fumbled in his pocket and turned. With a shaking hand he quickly withdrew the revolver. Now, shuddering, he lifted the flickering match. Then he began screaming, even as he fired again and again. Beck circled the biplane about the spire of the rock and headed towards the ethereal vapours forming in the sky before him. The cloud expanded, riven with flashes of uncanny light. Much had been promised to him in that long night, and in return much must be given. Allenby was merely the first. Beck was eager to please.